People have been talking to me online about how Darth Vader is such a bad person. It's very clear, and it's very well established from those actions. But if you can't look and see that Anakin blowing up the Death Star...
That was actor Charlie Barnett, who plays Yord on The Acolyte. And Rutro, he got a piece of Star Wars lore wrong? Sound the alarms! Alert the church elders! A Star Wars actor got a piece of Star Wars trivia wrong! Kathleen Kennedy sold my cat for fentanyl!
Boy, I really hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
For the past few months, ever since The Acolyte began marketing itself, it's caught the ire of disgruntled Star Wars fans who are quite displeased with the direction this franchise has taken since Disney bought it. And as such, there's been a pretty insane amount of unfair hate thrown its way since well before we actually knew anything about the story. And even when we did have actual content to pick apart, there was this weird thing I kept seeing where a certain set of fans would focus all their hatred toward the most menial aspects instead of any actual flaws with the writing, character work, or anything that actually informs the quality of the story. Like, did you know that in a completely separate continuity from the one this show takes place in, Ki-Adi-Mundi wouldn't be born for another 40 years? Well, if you've been on Star Wars Twitter for the last couple of months, I don't know how you wouldn't know that, since that's all anyone wanted to talk about after Episode 4 came out. In the case of our boy Chuck saying Anakin blew up the Death Star, I don't really think it's that big of a deal for a number of reasons. The first of which is that it could have just been a slip of the tongue, but then again, he did say it twice on separate occasions.
Well, Anakin just killed a whole Death Star. How many people died on that? Is that not bad? But I find that...
So it does seem like he actually has it in mind that Luke is Anakin. It's an understandable enough mistake to make if you're someone who isn't that familiar with Star Wars and only really have a casual amount of knowledge about the mythos, which Charlie himself admitted to just seconds prior in the same interview.
As a person who's outside and just a fan coming in...
And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The actors aren't the writers. They're not the ones who need to know the ins and outs of the story and how it all fits together. And it's totally okay if Charlie simply isn't that big of a Star Wars fan. As long as he delivers the lines that were written for him and hands in an excellent performance, I see no issue. There is something to be said about how actors really should become intimate with the characters they play and develop an understanding of who they are, where they're from, and what drives them, so that they can give the most authentic performance possible. But there's nothing to suggest that Charlie didn't do that with Yord just because he mixed up Luke and Anakin. In fact, you know what? I happen to have it on good authority that actor Mark Hamill had never even seen a Star Wars movie when he was cast as Luke Skywalker. Yet, I'd still say he managed to do a pretty good job despite that, wouldn't you agree? You might counter my obvious attempt at sarcasm by saying that the difference is obviously that there was nothing in Star Wars to have seen going in, so the original cast gets a pass where a new actor coming in isn't afforded the same luxury, but I'd simply ask why. Again, it's not the actor's job to know the lore, they just need to do their jobs well. If we gave shit to every Star Wars actor who doesn't know jack shit about the lore, Harrison Ford would have been crucified a long time ago. That's just one example of what I consider to be a pretty desperate attempt to hate on every single aspect of the show you can think of without paying any mind to what works and what doesn't. Stuff like that, the Ki-Adi-Mundi thing I mentioned already, fire in space, which is an issue with the show, but a lot of people made a bigger deal about it than it deserved. It was all anyone talked about for like 2 weeks. It's come together to create this really toxic environment where all the discourse surrounding the Acolyte is either one side mindlessly spewing vitriol, or defenders refusing any and all criticisms and writing anyone who's even slightly critical off as a grifter who went in looking to hate it. In other words, welcome back to Disney Star Wars, ladies and gents. Now, as most of you probably already know, I don't think The Acolyte was very good. I've already made an entire video breaking down the 5th episode because it was just that bad, and my friends and I have done multiple streams analyzing the series in exhaustive detail. There are several hours of content available on my channel providing my full thoughts on the show, and you can all check that stuff out if you haven't already. But seeing as this is my official review, I'm gonna try to do what I always do and approach it as fairly as I possibly can. Now that I've opened with something that's sure to have both sides mad at me no matter what I say, I might as well give my honest opinion and let you make of it what you will. Frankly, I don't even know where to begin. I guess it's worth addressing the fact that I did already make a video on this show, and because of the nature of how that critique was structured, it intentionally left out additional context that we got from episodes that followed the one I was reviewing. Even though episodes 6 and 7 were already out by the time I released the video, and had actually provided certain pieces of context for the things I criticized, the reason I left that out was because the whole idea was to break down episode 5 and make certain predictions predictions about where the story would go next, and how they might try to explain away the issues present. Episode 5 was the one where a large group of Jedi faced off against a Sith Lord, and one of them walked away to tell the tale. So naturally, I said that the only way he doesn't report this encounter to the Jedi is if all the characters act incredibly stupidly, and that's exactly what happens. When we next pick up, Sol takes the ship up into the sky and tries to contact the Jedi, but there's apparently some kind of interference that makes it hard for them to make out exactly what he's saying. He could still at least mention the Sith, but he decides instead to say this.
My whole team is dead.
Before then going off to reset the transceiver and try to get a better signal. Had he said the word Sith here, there's a good chance the Jedi on the other end would have heard it, considering later he reports Sol's message to Vernestra and more or less seems to have made out what he was saying.
There were casualties.
Who?
The connection was faulty, but it sounded like the entire team.
But alright, fine. That didn't work. But thankfully, once the transceiver is reset, the Jedi attempt to make contact again, and this time the signal is clear. Unfortunately, right as Sol rushes to the console, the power goes out in the entire ship. How unlucky. It's not entirely clear, but the strong implication for why this happened at the worst possible moment is that Sol's efforts are intentionally being sabotaged by Basil, the little guide badger that the Jedi brought along on the mission. I have absolutely no idea why Basil would do that, but there are two separate occasions where Sol is trying to do something and is actively undermined by him, and he seems to be doing it on purpose, so I really don't know what this guy wants. He seems to know the person with Sol is actually May disguised as Osha, which is something Sol is actually fooled by, despite the fact that that's really stupid for multiple reasons we went over last time. But I have no idea how that factors into sabotaging the ship's controls. What is he trying to accomplish? She then has to do repairs and try to get the ship operational again, but in the time it takes for her to do that, Sol figures out that she's actually May for reasons I can't even begin to understand. Like, I rewatched the scene with the benefit of hindsight and still have no idea what it is she said that tipped him off. So he knocks her out, and then when the Jedi try to talk to Sol and let him know they're coming in, he shuts off the transceiver and jumps into hyperspace, just barely missing the Jedi envoy that's come to investigate just what the fuck happened here. And if you're scratching your head right now trying to figure out just why the fuck he did that, don't worry, you're not alone. We find out in the finale that his plan is to take May back to Brendok and have the Jedi meet them there so he can prove the existence of a vergence on the planet, which he can apparently only do so long as he has both Osha and May with him. I don't know why that's the case, it just is. And I have a lot of questions about this decision. If he needs both twins in order to prove to the Jedi that there's a vergence here, then how exactly does he expect to do that without Osha? As far as he should know, Osha would still be down on Kofar, having been knocked out or possibly even killed by May when she decided to take her place. So how exactly does he expect Osha to get here? The only reason Osha even knows to go to Brendok is because she has a vision of May killing Sol and is able to surmise the location based on the surrounding area, I guess. But I don't think we're meant to believe Sol knew that would happen or that she would actually have the means to get there, and we know that he needs both the twins to do what he's trying to do.
There is a vergence on this planet. Now that you and Osha are both alive, I can prove it.
Without May, there was no proof you were created in this way.
So I really have no idea what the plan was here, or why he didn't simply wait for the Jedi to show up and have them follow him to Brendok, other than for the meta reason that if he acts in this incredibly suspicious way, the Jedi might have reason to suspect he was behind the massacre on Kofar. Also, maybe it's just me, but it kind of feels like the fact that a bunch of Jedi were just slaughtered by a man calling himself a Sith should take priority over proving the existence of a vergence in the Force. This is information that Sol is apparently not all that interested in discussing with the Jedi Order at large, and it's because of this that the word Sith manages to die with him in the finale. By the end, Vernestra knows full well that Sol isn't really the one who killed all those Jedi, because as a matter of fact, she apparently knows Jason and sensed his presence when the Jedi arrived on Brendok, but she decides to pin the whole thing on Sol for reasons. Like, she's worried about an external review of the Jedi by a coalition of senators who are advocating to keep them in check. So instead of going with the actually true story that a mysterious Darksider is running around causing havoc, she decides that what's sure to make the Jedi look really good is telling them that a Jedi Master went rogue and killed a bunch of Jedi in order to cover up a dark secret from 16 years ago. Okay, then.
If it were to become public that a former Jedi killed one of our own,
Our political enemies could use it against us.
It's not entirely clear by the end of the show what exactly the Jedi know, because Vernestra keeps a lot of it secret for some reason, and seems to believe the High Council can't be trusted with discretion. So it's all very complicated, and that's by design. The writers have intentionally kept it vague who knows what, so that there's plausible deniability by the end. I guess she never decided to update that small council of Jedi she brought in to discuss the situation in the first place, so Mundy's off the hook. I also have no idea what she told Yoda in the end, because we don't see that conversation. But it's a good bet that she regurgitated the same lie to him as she did the senators, given her apparent views on the council's ability to keep a secret. They took a character that a lot of people like from the books and turned her into a corrupt authority figure within the Jedi Order who somehow manages to get away with keeping vital information from those who outrank her. And this is all in service of trying to keep it vague what the Jedi do and don't understand about the situation by the Phantom Menace. But had Sol simply said the word Sith when he initially made contact with the Jedi, had Basil not sabotaged Sol's efforts to communicate with the Order for literally no other reason than that it's what the plot demanded, and had all these characters made any decision that wasn't positively brain dead, the secret would have been out. I suspect the writers are rather proud of themselves for maintaining the canon by piling bad writing on top of itself, but I'd argue even with all these technicalities they tried to pull, we'd still have several issues. Like I said in the last video, Mundy is at least in the know about a powerful dark side user who trained May, and that information is going to factor into how he talks about the prospect of the Sith's return in episode 1. Let's even go with the notion that Vernestra told him and the other Jedi in the small council the same lie she fed to the senators, that May was trained up by Sol and that he was the one responsible for the Jedi massacre. When Qui-Gon asserts that he was attacked in the desert by a powerful Force user who was trained in the Jedi arts, Mundy could have easily brought up the fact that that doesn't necessarily mean the Sith have returned. What's much more likely is that we have another Sol situation. A powerful Jedi master has gone rogue and secretly trained up an apprentice. Before any of these Jedi are willing to accept that the most powerful enemy of their order is back and plotting, they'd be quicker to declare that an investigation of all the Jedi is necessary to figure out where Maul came from. Which, actually, come to think of it, would be contradictory in its own right, since, as of the beginning of Attack of the Clones, most of the Jedi on the Council staunchly refused the notion that a former master might do anything so evil as to attempt to assassinate a senator.
Do you have any idea who is behind this attack? I think the Count Dooku is behind it.
He is a political idealist, not a murderer.
Count Dooku was once a Jedi. It's not in his character.
You could try to argue that maybe Windu doesn't know about Sol because that was before his time and probably kept under wraps from most of the other Jedi, but you can't really do that with Mundy, can you? Can't even do that with Yoda, depending on what he was told by Vernestra. It's almost like if you actually pay attention to the dialogue, there's more to what the Jedi believe about the Sith than simply, they're gone, lol. Details matter. For those of you who are playing catch-up here, I do apologize. I usually try to provide as much context as I can when I do these breakdowns, because I recognize that a lot of you haven't seen the show and come to me to see what exactly it is you're not missing. To a lot of you, this all probably sounds like gibberish, but there's a lot to break down, and if I stopped to explain every aspect you might not have understood, we'd be here all day. So let's take a more general approach to this. I want to get into exactly what this show was trying to accomplish, but in order to do that, bear with me as I explain the merits of cause and effect and why they're necessary for a story to function. Storytelling is a craft that's made up of multiple base parts, and I think if it falters in any one of these things, that's an issue. That's why when people tell me plot doesn't matter, I get annoyed, because the plot is necessarily the backbone of any good story. It goes hand in hand with things like character work and world building, which all bounce off of each other and work together to form a coherent narrative that feeds into themes, which I'd say is ultimately the point of any story. You can still have functional themes if any one of these aspects has flaws here and there, as long as they're each on the whole really well put together. And obviously there is no one quantity with which one should be prioritized over the other. I tend to think world building is the least important of the three, but really you need all three of them. Now, in order to build a solid plot, you have to make sure that the sequence of events flows naturally and follows basic cause and effect. Events happen in the story because of what happened previously that the characters or factions in the world are now reacting to. For this example, let's use A New Hope. That's a movie that I think we can all agree is pretty neat, right? It makes logical sense that Luke and Obi-Wan would go into the cantina and come to an agreement with Han and Chewie, since they're there looking for a pilot to take them to Alderaan, and Han and Chewie are looking for a big score to pay off their debts to Jabba. It makes sense that by heading to Alderaan, they would naturally find themselves being pulled aboard the Death Star, since that's where the Death Star currently is, thanks to which prisoner is being held there, and her being in Imperial captivity is what's brought all these characters into the plot in the first place. This may all seem like basic stuff to you, and that's because it is. It's easy to take things like this for granted where basic cause and effect are at play and are driving the story, because that's how all stories ought to be for all intents and purposes. That's why we don't typically focus on these things in generally well-made movies, because otherwise you'd just be doing a plot summary, and that's not very good analysis. But it's when these things falter that you have to stop and assess the damage, and this mainly comes in the form of plot holes or contrivances. In A New Hope, there are a few contrivances that push the story along in various ways, which fluctuate in severity. For example, it's kind of convenient that R2 and C-3PO managed to not get shot while running across this corridor, but it's not really that big a deal because even if they did die here, Leia would have just put the plans in a different R2 unit, and then we'd be following that droid instead. So it's a bit lucky, but the severity is pretty low. A much larger example, I think, is that when the droids actually do get down to the planet and are captured by the Jawas, they're taken to the Lars homestead and C-3PO is bought by Owen, along with this red astromech droid R5-D4. This really only happens to momentarily generate some drama. Oh no, our dynamic duo of droids is about to be separated. And then a few seconds later, R5 breaks down, and this gives C-3PO the opportunity to let Luke know that, hey, there's this really cool, hardworking droid right over there that you should totally check out. And the rest, as they say, is history. If R5 hadn't randomly and conveniently broken down right there, then R2 would never have been sold to Owen, and Luke would have never found Leia's message. Maybe R2 might still have found his way to Obi-Wan's, but it would have happened without Luke or 3PO, and it might have taken him way longer to accomplish his mission. Meaning that by the time Obi-Wan was even made aware of what was going on, Leia would already be dead. Tarkin was planning to execute her after finding out she'd lied about the location of the rebel base, so if the heroes hadn't arrived when they did, she probably wouldn't have lasted much longer. Suddenly, we have a very different version of this story where Luke never gets involved, Leia is dead, and the rebellion never has a better chance to destroy the Death Star. Assuming they even manage to find it so they can launch an attack, Luke might not have been there to blow it up. All this is happening because one droid happened to explode out of nowhere. The reason this is a problem is that there was no setup for it. We as the audience had no way of looking at the information provided by the film and predicting that that was even a thing that could happen. So the stakes take a hit because now there's a precedent, however small, that random things can simply happen in order to facilitate outcomes the writer wants. A New Hope is a very well-written movie and is generally regarded as one of the best of the saga for good reason, but even it's not completely devoid of mistakes. But that's just one example. Now imagine a story that's riddled with issues just like this one. Imagine if essentially every single action is dictated not by the logical progression of events, but because the writers want a payoff that they haven't taken the time to actually earn. That's the Acolyte to a T. Take what I already went over with how the show tried to cover up the Sith's secret from the Jedi, where characters had to continuously make the worst possible decisions that were actively counter to their stated goals in order to ensure that none of the surviving Jedi ever heard the word Sith. The very fact that they injected a character into the story, told us nothing about him or why he's doing anything he's doing, and then proceeded to use him as a saboteur for Soul's efforts on 2 different occasions for seemingly no reason should be more than enough evidence that things are kinda just happening because the writers want them to, not because they're well set up or supported in the story. And this is far from the only example. If you're someone who hasn't seen the show and have only heard the shitty discourse surrounding it, you might have heard a complaint centered around the fact that Osha and May have the exact same hairstyle, despite having not seen each other in 16 years, and neither of them even knowing the other was alive for all that time, so it's not like one could be intentionally copying the other. That's a bit lucky, but I'm sure most of you would have heard that complaint and said, well, sure, but that's such a small detail. Anyone who unironically complains about that is really reaching, and if anything, that's a testament to how good the show must be if that's what they're having to resort to. And on the surface, that's an understandable reaction, but let me lay out all the reasons why that's actually a pretty big issue within the story. The fact that these 2 characters ended up with the same hairstyle after 16 years apart is the only reason the bartender who witnessed May kill Indara was able to so confidently identify Osha as the supposed killer. Had she had a completely different hairstyle, then he might reasonably be able to say, well, the attacker looked pretty similar to her, but the hair's completely different. And that's assuming he's ever even brought to Osha in the first place, since the only reason the Jedi even considered her a suspect was because she exactly matched May's description. So if the bartender had said the attacker had a mohawk or something, then she just never would have gotten roped into the plot. As a side note, the only other reason the Jedi are able to suspect Osha for the murder is the fact that she just happens to live close enough to where Indara was killed to have reasonably been able to get there and back before anyone on the Trade Federation ship even noticed she was missing, which again is a pretty huge convenience considering how big space is.
Can't we call for help? Yeah, because the universe is really quite small and there's bound to be someone nearby.
Again, none of this could have been planned by May, since she didn't even know Osha was alive until the second episode, meaning she somehow ended up looking exactly like her and committing a murder close to where Osha lives, so that her sister that she didn't even know still existed could be framed for the murder and brought into the fold. And then in episode 5, after the sisters have their big reunion and Osha decides to arrest May, May overpowers her, knocks her out, cuts her hair down to exactly Osha's length, and disguises herself as Osha to Soul, which somehow works, and that's all because they had similar enough hairstyles to begin with that simply cutting it down a bit made for a convincing impersonation of her sister. And there are probably a few things you're screaming at me right now, so let's address those. Yes, they're twins, which means it's entirely possible an eyewitness to May's crimes would have given a detailed enough description for the Jedi to think, hey, that sounds like Osha. But just because two people have identical faces doesn't necessarily mean anything. If there were enough physical differences in the way these characters looked, he might have seen Osha and been like, that can't be her, she looked like this. Or maybe he doesn't even remember her face that well since she only saw her for a few seconds and is mainly going off of her general description, which Osha just so happens to match. There's any number of possibilities. The second thing I'm sure you're all thinking is that both Osha and May had the same hairstyle when they were kids, so it makes enough sense that they'd each make the choice to go back to it as adults, even if that is still a bit unlikely. Or maybe they simply never changed it at all. But we at least know that's not true since we see a hollow image of Osha as a Padawan and she has a different haircut, and the Jedi are typically pretty lenient about letting their initiates keep certain cultural aspects to their appearance, things like hairstyles, headwear, that sort of thing. So Osha could have kept her childhood haircut if she really wanted to, as long as it was a cultural thing. But I imagine she probably wouldn't want to, considering she now associates that haircut with the girl who locked her in a room, started a fire, and as far as Osha is made to believe, killed everyone she's ever cared about. Osha did not have a happy childhood, and the show acknowledges at several points that it's a source of deep anger and trauma that she tried and failed to suppress during her Jedi training. So it's already kind of hard to believe she would choose to have physical reminders of that part of her life, let alone that she chose to return to that style at a point where Yord knew she looked like that so he could identify her based on May's description, and that she still had that style 6 years later at the same time as May. I understand how nitpicky this all sounds, but all of this happening the way it happens has facilitated major plot events at multiple different points on the show. And what's funny as well is the fact that the only reason there's even a living witness to give May's description is because May intentionally let him live after killing Indara. So, I think it's time we talk about the Sith and what the word secret means. I touched on this a little bit in my episode 5 video, but I'm already heavily critical of the fact that May has apparently been tasked with killing the 4 specific Jedi that she wants revenge against because she blames them for what happened to her on Brendok. It's either Jason himself ordered her to go after them specifically, or he told her she needed to kill a Jedi to prove her merit and she said, I have the perfect Jedi in mind, and he just went along with that. Either way, it's really stupid because he should absolutely not be allowing her to go after Jedi who have any personal connection to her, because that's a very good way to make her identity known to the Order when they inevitably investigate the matter. Maybe he knew Osha was alive and was relying on her taking the fall for Indara's murder, but surely once another Jedi drops while Osha's behind bars, she gets cleared of suspicion. Or at the very least, the Jedi recognize that there's another person out there targeting these specific Jedi. Either way, it doesn't really make sense to put May in a situation where the Jedi might find out who she is, because, you know, the whole point is that the Sith are trying to remain anonymous to ensure their continued survival. If the Jedi catch so much as a whiff of Sith activity, then the whole grand plan is put in jeopardy. And that's bad enough when it's a simple mistake on the Sith's part, but this is all being done on purpose. Jason is actively encouraging her to do this, and even when she leaves behind witnesses to her crimes, he doesn't immediately kill her like any Sith would when their Acolyte's identity is compromised. I also just don't think it's within character for her to let the bartender live, given what we know about her. They seem to be trying to make it out like she saw the scared little kid and had just too much empathy in her heart to bring herself to do something like that. But if she's a character who would hesitate to kill an innocent, then that's yet another reason why no Sith Lord worth their salt would ever even humor her as a potential apprentice. Unless he believes she could be made to forego her more compassionate aspects, like with Palpatine and Anakin, but even then, you definitely don't want to be sending them out as assassins on your behalf if they're not at a point where they'll kill anyone who sees their face. This is just absurd. But like I said in the other video, it seems like we're intentionally characterizing Jason as someone who doesn't apparently care all that much about maintaining the secrecy of the Sith or his identity, given the fact that he gives Soul that information unnecessarily and doesn't take the multiple opportunities he has to kill everyone on Kofar. But if that is the case, and Jason really is a Sith, then that leads me to question where his master is. There's no way he's the Sith master if he's this flippant with his identity. The Sith never would have made it to Palpatine if that was the case. And now that the finale is out, we finally have this big revelation. What? Huh? What?
Oh my gosh.
Huh? Oh my... No!
What?
Oh my god! No! Now, because of the intentional ambiguity that all these shows like to employ, it's not entirely clear what exactly Plagueis is doing here or what his relationship is to Jason. But either they're fellow Sith and Plagueis is the master while Jason's the apprentice, in which case it makes absolutely no sense that he's let Jason live this long given the way he's been acting, and the fact that he's apparently trying to train up an apprentice of his own, which, you know, is not ideal for the Sith master. Or he's a rival Sith who views Jason as a threat to his claim as Dark Lord. Or maybe Jason's not a Sith at all, and the fact that he's going around calling himself one is putting the existence of the real Sith in jeopardy. Whatever the case, the result is always the same. Plagueis should absolutely want Jason dead. The fact that he's apparently just here in Jason's cave means that either he's just been there the whole time and was, I guess, hiding from Osha. Can't really blame the guy, I'm also scared of women. Or he's there looking to kill Jason for the very obvious reasons we've already laid out and just apparently hasn't gotten around to it yet. Not sure what he's waiting for. Maybe he got there right as they were leaving for Brendock and thought, ah shoot, better luck next time. Except I can't even say that as a joke, because even if we unironically accepted that, Jason and Osha are back on that planet by the end of the episode, and Plagueis still hasn't managed to pull it off quite yet. There is, of course, an alternative explanation, which is that Plagueis and Jason are indeed working together, but he has no intention whatsoever in killing him, because the writers don't seem to realize the fact that Jason being so liberal with his identity is not something any Sith Lord would ever tolerate at this point in the timeline. And so to characterize a fan favorite like Plagueis as someone who's apparently just cool with Jason's recent exploits is to unintentionally make him extremely stupid and reckless himself. Now, given the fact that this is, for all intents and purposes, a new character, since none of his previous characterization from the EU is canon, and all we really know about him from the movies is what we're briefly told by Palpatine in episode 3, you can make this version of Plagueis a fucking idiot, but I'm going to question why. Why would you take a character whose main trait in the stories we best know him from is that he's incredibly intelligent and careful and turn him into something completely different? Isn't the only thing we actually know definitively about him that he's wise?
So powerful and so wise.
Or was Palpatine just embellishing for Anakin? And this is all in service to what, exactly? A brief moment of him standing there in a cave, not actually doing anything? Just a bare-bones, substanceless cameo meant to tease something potentially great in seasons to come? And I'm supposed to be happy about that? I'm supposed to clap and say, hell yeah, that's the guy from the book I really like, when it's literally not? I'm not averse to having Plagueis in this show. In fact, before we had any real details and all we actually knew was that it would vaguely be about the Sith and would be set 100 years before the prequels, my mind immediately went to Plagueis. Of course it did. I'm pretty sure everyone thought about that. And I'm in no way saying that this show had to be a one-to-one adaptation of the Darth Plagueis novel, otherwise they can keep it. Because while I would love to see that book faithfully adapted as a series, we have never appealed to adaptation as an argument for why a thing is good or bad on this channel. They're allowed to tell a completely new story with new characters, or even use Plagueis and give him an entirely different story than what we knew from the books. And as long as it's good, I'm all for that. But with the context I already laid out with Jason, if you're gonna include him in this show, I'm gonna be questioning why he's allowing this guy to run around exposing the Sith to the Jedi when it's not time yet. And for the love of God, actually give me something of substance if you're gonna put him in. They have a whole underdeveloped plotline this season about how Vernestra is afraid of various political opponents of the Jedi, and there's even a scene in the finale that I kind of like between her and Senator Rayencourt, David Harewood's character, where he basically tells her that his distaste for the Jedi is nothing personal. He just views them as an institution with way too much unjustified power and wants to see them put in check.
The majority of my colleagues can't imagine a galaxy without the Jedi. When you're looking up to heroes, you don't have to face what's right in front of you.
This is all very interesting stuff that needed to be greatly expanded upon, and I think Plagueis could have easily been mentioned or appeared here, given the fact that naturally he would have a stake in galactic politics one way or another. Again, it's not like they have to adapt this necessarily, but in the books he was the head of a prominent faction of the intergalactic banking clan, and if that had been carried over to this show, that might have actually come into play as to why the Senate are suddenly so interested in investigating the Jedi. Maybe Plagueis is lining the pockets of certain politicians to garner support for an anti-Jedi movement, and maybe he's using shell companies and all sorts of fronts so that the paper trail never gets directly traced back to him. So he's this private benefactor who's slowly and carefully restraining the amount of power and influence the Jedi have in the political arena as he continues to install his own operatives in positions of power. Really, this is just one suggestion. They could do any number of things, but if you're gonna put Plagueis in the show, I want you to actually use him for something instead of just dangling him in front of me like a baby with car keys.
And while you're at it, perhaps don't establish that his apprentice can do this.
He can just do that?
It was that simple?
It's that easy?
No.
No, we're not doing
fucking
this.
way, show.
We're
You
not
did not
doing
just
this.
do that.
No.
No.
That's insane.
No. I disagree.
No.
Disney, do you fucking know what this does to the world building?
Look what you did, you little jerk!
The Acolyte has just established that not only can the Force be used to erase memories, but also that it only takes a wave of a hand to virtually totally erase one's memories of their life and their identity. Now, I'm not going to pretend that the Force has not always been capable of a form of mind control since as early as
1977!
But if anyone is going to try to argue that this isn't far removed from that, I just have to say, is it though? The Jedi mind trick may have been one of the very first things we see done with the Force in A New Hope. However, even from its first usage, it was said to have only been effective on the weak-minded. This limitation was first shown in The Phantom Menace when Qui-Gon attempted to mind trick Watto, and it was later reinforced in the Clone Wars when even the Chosen One needed the assistance of Obi-Wan and Mace Windu in order to effectively mind trick Cad Bane. Furthermore, mind tricks are only shown to be capable of temporary persuasion of pretty simple commands. Undo my restraints, drop your weapon, you don't need to see our identifications, etc. Hell, even before Qui-Gon knows that Watto isn't susceptible to the mind trick, he doesn't try to make a more complicated command than accepting a different currency than he usually calls for, as opposed to just giving away the part needed to fix a hyperdrive, let alone freeing either of his slaves. I'm going to just assume in good faith that that's because of an implied secondary limitation with the mind trick, that the more complicated the command, the less likely it is to work on even the weak-minded. Which would also explain why mind tricks are never shown to completely change someone's personality or allegiance to whoever they're aligned with. Otherwise, why not just spam the mind trick on any given stormtrooper to leave the Empire and join the rebellion? In stark contrast to both of these limitations to this aspect of the Force that's existed since the beginning, the never-before-seen Force memory wipe, or as I'm going to be calling it, the Force neuralizer, has now been established in its very introduction to require just as much effort as mind-tricking a simple command in order to take away not just one memory, or only the most minor and disposable memories, but also your memory of your twin sister, your entire history, even your own name, even when used against a Force sensitive like May. In tandem with the mind reading shown in both the sequel trilogy and throughout the show, the Force is now capable of everything Professor X is capable of and then some, so that's cool, I guess. In all seriousness though, no, these two things are not the same. But even if we set all of that to one side, the fact that the show introducing this move is set before even the Phantom Menace naturally calls into question, where the fuck has this incredible ability been this whole time? Is it possible to learn this power from a Jedi? Is it forbidden for ethical reasons, even though mind tricks are clearly standard for a Jedi to learn how to do? You know what? Let's suppose that's the case and say that it's exclusively used by dark side Force users. Hell, let's take it one step further in the interest of the best faith possible towards this show, and assume that this is something that only Plagueis was powerful enough to do, and he passed on his knowledge to Jason, which we know he would have had to, because we've seen him Force neuralize May with ease. If Plagueis was willing to teach Jason this technique, why wouldn't he be willing to teach it to his succeeding apprentice, Palpatine? Especially when this sort of ability would naturally be extremely useful for furthering the Sith's agenda and long-term plan for galactic domination. If I had a week, I wouldn't be able to list all the practical applications of erasing a person's memory with the Force, especially for someone in Palpatine's position. So if we're to believe that Plagueis did share this knowledge with him, then why the hell have we not seen him use this incredible trick in any of his many appearances in the franchise? What reason do I have to believe he couldn't do this to any of the Jedi Masters sent to arrest him? Or if he's somehow too weak to do that, despite Jason being powerful enough to do this to twice as many Jedi charging at him all at once, how about doing this to Mace Windu at any point during their one-on-one fight? Or how about doing this to Yoda? Or how about doing this to Luke after he does the thing that the Last Jedi defenders always appeal to when defending their sacred cow? Or wait, let me guess, there was a character-based reason that was stopping him from doing this in any of those scenarios. One that we have to pull out of our asses, because not only was this absolutely not something George had in mind as something Palpatine could do while writing the story in either the original trilogy or the prequels, but also the Acolyte writers themselves couldn't be bothered to account for the world-building implications they introduced because they've confused cameos for storytelling, and they think it's reasonable to expect the audience to fill in these gaping blanks in the story for themselves. Or, as the party line was each week that the show was releasing episodes, just wait until the next episode or season or show, it'll all be explained eventually, man. But woohoo, Plagueis showed up for a few seconds. Star Wars is saved. Fuck you, the Acolyte.
As I said though, the fact that there are a faction of senators who apparently want an external review of the Jedi is pretty great potential for world building that the show largely squanders. Firstly, in order for me to understand any of what Vernestra does across the show, I need to know why she's so hellbent on preventing this external review from happening. What is she so afraid of them uncovering? I need to know what skeleton she's looking to keep buried, because otherwise I have no idea why anything is happening. I don't know why she's so quick to withhold information from the Jedi Council, because all the show will tell me is that whatever information they learned, they'd be inclined to tell the Senate. And that really doesn't make much sense, does it? If information that makes the Jedi appear weak or otherwise untrustworthy to the Senate is presented to the Council, why would they be inclined to tell them anything? Can they not just say, this is an internal matter, please respect our privacy while we conduct our own investigation? If it's the case that the Council would tell the Senate about things that actively undermine their political standing out of good faith, as in they're so principled and have so much integrity even at this point in the timeline that they simply can't bring themselves to withhold important information from the Senate, then I once again have to wonder how I'm meant to believe the Jedi are in any way corrupt, as the show continues to insist is the case. I was given to understand that since we're so close to the prequels timeline-wise, the bulk of the corruption we see in the Order would have already more or less taken shape long before this point. So the Order as we know it would essentially be the same as in the movies on that front, especially considering so many on the Council by then were already alive at this point and in positions of authority. In fact, wasn't it Yoda himself who advised against telling the Senate information that would make them look bad in Attack of the Clones?
I think it is time we inform the Senate that our ability to use the Force is diminished.
If inform the Senate is, multiply, our adversaries will.
I don't know, maybe good old Vern was the one who taught Yoda the art of keeping his fucking mouth shut. The problem is, we need a lot more details given about exactly what factions exist within the Jedi Order, because here we see Vernestra and a handful of others, including Mundi, convening to discuss matters that they're willing to not tell the High Council about, and that has so many implications that never really get explored. If you want me to buy that the Jedi never find out about the Sith, or hear so much as a word about the prospect of a rogue outsider training an apprentice to kill Jedi, then I'm gonna need at least some idea of why these Jedi follow Vernestra unquestioningly when it means lying to their superiors. I need to know why Vernestra doesn't want to tell anyone about the fact that Jason exists and is actually behind all the things she framed Soul for, and the show has not sufficiently answered any of those questions. Which is when a lot of people might say, wait for Season 2. Season 2 will explore all of that and more, just you wait. First of all, while I am morbidly curious to see where all these open threads lead in some kind of follow-up, I hope to God there isn't ever a Season 2. And second, this is something that's been tacked on to pretty much all the discourse since the show began, and it's really frustrating. It's this little asterisk that I've seen put over any and all criticism as a shield, and that is, the show isn't over and you should wait for more context before jumping to conclusions. And on the one hand, I understand and commend the mindset behind this reasoning. You're only trying to be fair to the show and give it the benefit of the doubt. But in the case of wait for Season 2, the issue is that we needed that information this season in order to properly understand the stakes of any given part of the story. For us to understand why all these events are progressing the way they are, we needed to know certain information that the show simply didn't tell us. I can make inferences here and there, but that is not the same thing as the show actually providing sufficient context ahead of time to make the narrative function. Even if all these questions are addressed and properly answered in the second season, that doesn't change the fact that it's too little too late. They have still failed to make a well-written season of television, and now I'm forced to wait a nebulous amount of years for something that might fix the issue, which may never even come out. But also, that basically never happens. Every time I was told to wait for more context, the context came, and all it did was make it worse. I was told to wait for more context when Episode 5 had Jason out himself as a Sith to a Jedi and let him live to tell the tale, and while you can technically bullshit your way into the argument that the Jedi end up learning nothing, that's only facilitated by terrible writing that we've already gone over. I was told to wait for more context when Episode 3 came out and told us basically nothing that we didn't already know about what happened on Bryndock and why the Jedi were even there, and then Episode 7 certainly gave us context, that's for sure. There's a lot to break down about what happened on Bryndock and what the show is trying to say about it, so let's not waste any time. Basically, we find out that the reason the Jedi were on this planet at all was because Bryndock used to be uninhabitable after the Great Hyperspace Disaster like 100 years prior, a reference to the High Republic books. But something changed around 10 years ago. Life is suddenly flourishing here, and the team have been sent to find out why, suspecting that the only thing that can cause something like this is a vergence in the Force. You remember those, right?
I've encountered a vergence in the Force.
The movies never really go into exactly what that is, beyond that it has something to do with the anomaly that is Anakin, but this show expands on it to say that it's a
concentration of Force energy. centered around a location.
I was gonna say that! I find it kinda weird that this conversation is only just happening now, 7 weeks into the mission.
I've been here for 7 weeks.
And it's being explained to a character who you'd think would know what a vergence is, but apparently he was sick the day they learned that in youngling class, so they're telling him now, 2 months after they got here, because no one decided to brief the Padawan, I guess. But anyway, they go on to explain that a vergence is something that can create life, which I guess explains its association with Anakin. The Jedi have come here in search of the vergence that caused life to thrive once more on Brendok, and they're scanning the ground with, metal detectors? I don't know. Maybe if Sol puts this moss into a little box thing, he can scan for the source of the vergence. We also learn in episode 3 that Osha and May were apparently born of no father. Again, just like with Anakin.
Where is their father?
They have no father.
I carried them.
I created them.
And what happens if the Jedi discover how you created them?
And this is another thing people told me to wait for context on, because surely the show is going to give us a reasonable explanation for all the many questions that raises, such as, how? The thing about Anakin's creation is that it was done by the Force, the most powerful thing that exists in this universe, and I guess the implication is that the witches were able to tap into the power that was already there thanks to this apparent vergence in order to create the twins, which, because we don't have all the time in the world, I'm not even going to get into. Fine, whatever, let's just accept that. What I want to talk about is the fact that all the way back in the first episode, we're told that Osha was apparently 8 years old when inducted into the Jedi Order, which if you have even a passing familiarity with the movies, you might remember is pretty old for Jedi training.
When did you join the Order?
When I was 8.
A major concern about admitting you to the Order was your age.
My circumstances were unique, but the Jedi Council made their decision.
Like, you basically have to be massively important for the Jedi to make an exception, like the fact that Luke was essentially the last hope of the Jedi, and so Yoda had to start training him when he was in his 20s.
He is too old. Too old to begin the training.
Or the fact that Anakin is literally the chosen one, and even then there were all sorts of reasons why the Jedi Council didn't want to train him, and only eventually conceded once Obi-Wan basically told them, fuck you, I'm doing it anyway. The reason why Anakin's training was a topic of great controversy was because of a lot of different factors. His age wasn't ideal because children typically form strong emotional attachments to their parents by then that are hard to fully overcome. And with Anakin specifically, he had a lot of baggage due to a seriously traumatic upbringing as a slave. The Jedi were fearful of what he might become if given the tools to access greater power down the line, and that's despite the fact that many of them seemed to believe the prophecy was real and that he was meant to bring balance to the Force. And if you look at the context surrounding Osha, it's the exact same thing, only if anything, she probably would have had even more trauma than Anakin. Osha watched everything she ever knew and loved go up in flames around her. Her home was burned to the ground thanks to a fire her sister started after threatening to kill her, and as far as she was led to believe, that fire claimed the life of her sister and all the people who had raised her whole life. At the very least for Anakin, his mom was still alive, and he wasn't actively mourning the loss of the only person who genuinely cared for him. Osha had everything going against her in terms of whether or not the Jedi would let her train.
And I have made peace with what happened on Brandok.
That was a lesson you tried to teach me many times, to accept what I'd lost, and I wasn't a very good student. I could never learn to calm my negative emotions, my hatred of you, my grief over our mother.
So the only way it could make even the remotest amount of sense that the Jedi Council would allow Osha into the Order despite all this baggage is if she was exceptionally important, i.e. the product of an immaculate conception born of a vergence in the Force. But if the Jedi know about that, then that fucks with the fact that they don't even bring it up when Qui-Gon discovers Anakin and declares he's the chosen one. They had an initiate with the exact same circumstances as him barely a century ago, which, as I keep having to remind people, is within living memory for a lot of these Jedi. So either way, it doesn't make sense. Either they know the origin of her birth and make an exception because of that, and that fucks with the continuity, or they don't know how she was born and have every reason not to accept her into the Order, but do so anyway because what the show ends up going with is option 2. Sol tells Osha in the finale that if he'd told the Council the truth about how she was created, they would have sent her away and never would have let her become a Jedi. Which, guys, I think you have that backwards. He also says he wouldn't have been able to prove it anyway without May, which I questioned earlier, but I really want to explore exactly what he means by that. There was a scene during the flashback where the Jedi ran the girls' blood samples to test for midichlorian counts, and the results ended up being that their symbionts were apparently the exact same as each other's. Basically, the reveal here is that they're actually not twins, but in fact the same person split between two people somehow. I have no idea how that works. I have no idea what that even means. These two have wildly wildly different personality traits and desires, they react to information in very different ways despite having had the exact same upbringing, and they even cast different actors to play them as kids. Amanda Stenberg plays both their roles for the present day stuff, but they cast twins to play the child versions, which means they quite literally don't even look like each other. But it's because of this revelation that the Jedi are able to conclude May and Osha are the product of this vergence. In essence, the very existence of these children are the proof they've been looking for, and they have the blood samples. They can show the council that data. What do you mean you need both the twins to prove it? What would you be able to do if you had both of them that you wouldn't be able to do with just one? I'm so confused. The only possible explanation I can think of for this is that the council just wouldn't trust the word of the Jedi that the blood samples in question are from two different individuals, and they'd want to have both the twins so they can run these tests for themselves. But I have no idea why that would be the case. What reason would the council have to not trust the Jedi they assigned to this mission in the first place? What reason, as far as they're aware, do the Jedi have to lie about the results of their mission? And because none of this is explained, I can't really give you an answer, meaning we just have a bunch of random bullshit happening that doesn't make a lick of sense. People told me to wait for context to find out why the Jedi might accept Osha into the Order without being made aware of her immaculate birth, and the only explanation the show gave me on that front was, because they did? Lol. But there's so much more to break down regarding the Brendock flashbacks, specifically in reference to how the show tries to depict the Jedi. Now, earlier I went over briefly why a consistent and logical plot is necessary in order to bolster the themes, which are ultimately the goal of any writer, and never has that been more true than with this absolute disaster of a production. Because throughout the show, we're constantly told that something really bad happened on Brendock that the Jedi feel at least partially responsible for. It's something that May seems to blame them for, and is initially surrounded in mystery. But whatever the Jedi's involvement in the catastrophe that caused the witch's death must have been really bad, considering one of them spent the rest of his life feeling so guilt-ridden that he fucking kills himself. Soul also alludes to it several times in a way that makes it clear he's always felt really bad about whatever role he played in those events. So all of us were on the edge of our seats just waiting to learn what could have possibly happened. And then finally, the penultimate episode was dedicated entirely to flashbacks that explain everything, and oh boy, it's a doozy. So, like I explained earlier, the Jedi are on this planet looking for signs of a vergence, and eventually Soul discovers the witch's fortress after creeping on these little girls playing in the woods. Don't know how the Jedi spent 7 weeks on this planet, parked so close to the obvious mountain fortress, and only just now discovered the witch coven, but here we are. Soul sneaks into the fortress to investigate the witches and sees Mother Anasea training the twins in combat. The moment he specifically witnesses is her shoving them down with the Force, which frankly was a pretty irresponsible thing to do given how easily they could have bashed their heads into the stairs, but I'm kind of nitpicking with that point. It just bothers me. Look how close they were. Then again, the way Soul reacts to her pushing them kind of makes it seem like he also registered it as abuse, so hey, maybe I'm actually onto something. In any case, he goes back to the Jedi to tell them what he found, and when they learn that the witches are preparing the children for some sort of ceremony, they took that as cause to break into the fortress and confront the Coven. So far, all the actions the Jedi have taken have been in service of protecting children, albeit while acting in ways some might consider hostile if not given the proper context, forcing their way into someone else's home. The witches don't like this very much, obviously, but Anasea advises them not to take hostile action against them that might provoke a violent outcome, which is sound advice, though I wish she herself would have taken it. A lot of bloodshed might have been avoided had she not taken control of Torben's mind. And, okay, I'm gonna level with you for a moment. Some of what I'm about to get into is a bit sensitive of a topic, so if you're someone who struggled in the past with things like sexual assault, I advise you to proceed with caution here, because I consider what Anasea does to Torben to be rape, plain and simple. It's not intrinsically sexual, which is why a lot of people don't really seem to register it as rape, but it is one of the most violating things you can do to another person. She forces her way into his mind, accesses his memories, wants, and desires, and manipulates them to serve her own ends. And I don't want to mince words here. That's rape. It's quite disgusting how the show plays this, actually. From the beginning of this episode, Torben has been anxious. He doesn't see a point in the mission they're on, he hates having to rough it on Brendock, and he just wants to go home. Anasea plays on this desire and plants the seeds for the actions Torben will take later in this episode, which admittedly are pretty impulsive and probably could have been handled better, but I frankly don't accept the notion that Torben did anything wrong when he eventually stormed into the witch's fortress at the end. By that point, the Jedi had tested both of the children and learned all the stuff we already went over about their creation situation, but on top of that, they'd been given several reasons to believe Osha and May were in serious danger from these witches, and all that came to a head in this moment where Torben wasn't in full control of himself. Earlier in the episode, when they were testing May, they asked her about the tattoo that had been magically branded onto her forehead the night before, as a mark signifying that she was now committed to serving in their coven for the rest of her life without the possibility of ever getting to choose her own path, by the way. And she rather poorly explained the concept of the Ascension ritual. What Anasea actually told her, as seen in episode 3, was this.
Ascension is about walking through fear. It is about sacrificing a part of yourself.
But this is how May explained it to the Jedi.
Mama said, everyone must walk through fear. Everyone must be sacrificed to fulfill their destiny.
Bit of an inconvenient miscommunication on her part, but you can clearly see how that sounds to the Jedi, and that on top of what the witches did to Torben and what Sol witnessed as abuse gives them an uneasy feeling, to say the least. They have good reason to suspect danger, and now they know that Osha and May are the key to completing their mission, so of course the next course of action is to investigate the witches further. Again, I won't deny that Torben rushed off impulsively when the more responsible thing to do would be to confer with the Jedi Council, but considering they believe the witches were imminently planning to sacrifice innocent children in some kind of ritual, I can also completely understand the haste. Nonetheless, Sol chases after Torben before he does anything stupid with the intent of bringing him back to the camp. He only decides to take action when Torben reports that the door to the elevator shaft has been locked from the inside.
I think they've locked the girls inside. The elevator's been disabled.
You can't go. We're stuck here now.
No, there's no time to waste. I'm with the Jedi on this one. Move your ass. Another thing worth noting here is that a lot of people have argued with me that the twins weren't in any danger. That just because the Jedi believed they were doesn't give them the right to meddle in affairs that have nothing to do with them, so they're still in the wrong for breaking in and causing all the mayhem that followed. But that's not true. Basically, Mother Anasea seems to be flipping back and forth in terms of whether or not she's gonna let Osha go with the Jedi because it's what she wants, and this is something we see in both the flashback episodes, her wrestling with whether or not it should be Osha's choice, or if she's just too young to make such a life-altering decision, which is pretty ironic considering just the previous night they were basically forcing Osha into a ritual where she would swear total allegiance to this cult now and forever and would never be able to change her mind. Like, at least the Jedi let people leave the Order whenever they want. But anyway, it seems what Anasea ultimately decided was she was gonna let Osha choose for herself, which is dandy. Unfortunately, all the other witches are like, actually no, let's not have that, and then they effectively stage a coup in order to force Osha to stay here. They all collectively go ahead with the plan to lock the fortress up from the inside, and Mother Coral instructs May to stop Osha from leaving.
You want to stop Osha from leaving? Then stop her.
Which May takes to mean lock her in her fucking room. Yeah, by the way, the girl's bedroom door has a lock on the outside of it. Wonder what that's about. So yeah, call me crazy, hot take. I'm gonna go ahead and take the firm position that a coven of witches who are actively imprisoning a little girl with the intent of essentially enslaving her to your tribe for the rest of her days is, you're the bad guys. Pretty black and white, actually. But wait, there's more! After May locks Osha in their room, she grabs a lantern off the wall and uses it to light a book the Jedi gave her on fire, which, you know, burns the book, and to May's apparent surprise, causes fire to happen. That freaks her out and makes her drop the book and the lantern, and then the fire spreads way out of her control and ends up burning down the whole compound. I remember assuming after episode 3 that there had to be more context than that, since there's no way that little fire managed to make it to the power generator and cause it to explode. You guys know fire doesn't spread across stone, right? But nope, that's what happened. The mystery surrounding the fire on Bryndock that's been built up all season was that May started it. You know, exactly like Sol and all the other characters and the audience already believed to be the case. That's what they did with that. Excellent. And don't forget that this only happened because May was encouraged by her authority figures to imprison her sister. So all the chaos and calamity that came from this fire was not the fault of the Jedi, but of the witches and their unwillingness to let go of Osha. Like, for example, when May came running out into the courtyard in a panic because there was a fire engulfing the hallway, and for some reason that caused Coral to spring into attack mode and Mother Anasea to do, I don't even really know how to describe it, so I'm just gonna play the clip for you and hope copyright doesn't fuck me. She does that. Sol obviously has no idea what to make of this. All he sees is a powerful witch who's previously attacked and violated a colleague of his turn into some kind of black smoke monster with a demonic face, and appears to be disintegrating one of the children he came here to protect. I should also mention that this whole sequence is being slowed down by the show so we can even comprehend what's happening. So from Sol's perspective, all this random bullshit is going down in the span of like a few seconds. He has no idea what's going on, very little time to act, and believes an innocent's life is in danger. So he makes the only sensible choice and stabs Anasea in the chest. She tells him she was gonna let Osha go, and it's played like a really tragic death from a misunderstood character, but, you know, frankly, I don't feel much sympathy for the person who mind-raped a young man who'd done absolutely nothing to her. Also, I don't like this framing that it's some tragic irony, that if only Sol had realized Anasea was actually gonna let Osha choose, this all could have been avoided, when not only do the rest of the witches have no intention of letting her go, as we already discussed, but Anasea herself made it seem like she was planning to keep Osha from them earlier in this same scene.
You wish to know if we will allow Osha to join you? To be raised by an institution instead of a family.
This show refuses to just let anything make sense, because if even one character acted according to their own established motivations, nothing would ever happen. There would never be any misunderstandings that drive the plot forward. Now, it should be said that despite everything that's gone down, Sol and Torben are still trying to handle this as peacefully as they possibly can. They refuse to actually fight in any other way than defensively.
Fight me!
Sol refuses to attack Coral, and Torben is only deflecting the arrows being shot at him. They are both still doing the most Jedi thing possible right now. But unfortunately, as the show sees it, Sol has already committed his cardinal sin, the thing that will haunt him for the rest of his life and ultimately doom him, as the show tries to paint him as a monster who committed an act of true villainy.
That man who killed your mother, he was a kind, brilliant, compassionate man, and he did a terrible thing.
We're gonna get into that, but I'm not done with this scene. Finally, Kelnaka shows up, but unfortunately the witches take this opportunity to all climb into his mind and start puppeteering him around, forcing him to fight his friends. Yet another instance of these witches mind-raping a Jedi who was only trying to do the right thing. I haven't even really talked about the lore implications of this yet, because the thematic butchering that it's caused is a much bigger problem in my opinion, but it is really OP that these witches can just do that to a Jedi. And not only can they do that, they can do it while still maintaining a conversation with other people. As if it's easy. Just really crazy that this franchise has long since stopped caring about introducing lore-breaking magic into their world. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Anyway, Kelnaka is eventually freed by Indara when she uses the Force to expel the witches from his mind. She could just do that. Fine, I don't care. But doing this causes all the witches to die. So just to get a head count here, all the witches are killed in this episode by Jedi who are acting in defense of people they're trying to save. Sol killed Anasea to save May, and Indara killed all the rest of them trying to save Kelnaka. And the show will swear to you up and down that the Jedi did anything wrong here. There is only one thing I can point to in this whole episode that I would consider a sin on the part of Sol, and even then it's contextual. He rushes into the power generator room to see Osha and May standing on either side of a broken bridge that's about to collapse, and when it does, he quickly grabs it with the Force in a struggle to keep it up. I have no idea why he would grab the bridge instead of just using the Force to catch the girls, and even if it's simply that he had to think quickly and that's where his mind went to, I don't know why he isn't now adjusting his grip so that he's holding onto them specifically and letting the bridge fall. But because Sol's a fucking idiot, that's the state of play. And what Sol chooses to do when he realizes he can't continue to support both is let May fall so he can devote more power to supporting Osha. Ultimately, Osha was the only one he saved, and that was a direct result of Sol making a choice. He chose to put Osha before May, and that's something he should feel guilty about. It might very well be that he believed he could only save one, and if he didn't decide quickly, then they'd both be lost. But regardless, that's a decision I can imagine would weigh on him heavily for the rest of his life. But what's interesting about this is that that's not what the show chooses to focus on when it eventually tries to paint Sol as having done wrong. There is one moment I can think of where he seems to reflect on that with some amount of guilt.
I wanted to save you both.
What happened that night wasn't your fault, Sol. I've told you that.
You did.
But otherwise, it never really comes up again. At the end of this episode, and in the climax of the finale, the show tries to use the fact that Sol killed Anasea as the point in which he fucked up. The Jedi make the choice to lie to the Council about what went down because if Sol were to confess what he did, he'd face some sort of dire consequence that would prevent him from being able to train Osha, and that just wouldn't be fair to her. It's such bullshit. In the finale, when Sol finally confesses to Osha about it, he never bothers to actually explain the context surrounding why he did it, and ultimately this moment is treated like he's finally having to face the ugly truth about what he did. He did this horrible thing because he was selfish and he developed an unhealthy attachment to Osha. In truth, he was being driven by emotions, by fear, and that's not the Jedi way. I think if you were to ask the showrunners, they'd probably tell you this was meant to be a morally gray topic. Soul definitely fucked up, but it's still bad of Osha to give in to her anger and kill him for his sin. But I'm afraid, Leslie, you don't get to have that because you haven't bothered to justify why any of what the Jedi did here was wrong. And so this is what I mean when I say a theme is only as good as the plot that supports it. The show wants to be this nuanced critique of an institution that's deeply flawed. In their attempts to do good, they can sometimes leave pain and suffering in their wake, and sometimes they're better off just leaving well enough alone. Even the best of us can falter, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But because the actual text has made it abundantly clear that the Jedi were completely in the right, I have no idea how I'm supposed to accept that theme. If the plot tells me one thing and then the characters just overtly state the theme the writer was trying to go for, and the two don't mesh in any way, then what we're left with is a muddled, confused mess of a narrative. I look at Torben and I see a scared kid who was in way over his head, who had one of the most horrific things you can do to a person happen to him, and he didn't have the tools to properly deal with that. In response, he overcorrected and fortified himself so completely that no one could ever possibly get inside his head like that again, and it made him a closed-off hermit who never interacted with anyone, and who quite literally put up barriers to make sure no one could ever touch him without his consent. On top of that, he spent so many years of his life feeling immense guilt for something that really wasn't his fault, and when that guilt became too much for him, he took his own life. The show did not acknowledge what he actually went through and tried to present it as though he was even slightly to blame for what happened to the witches, which just does not sit right with me. And I look at Soul and see someone who did the best he could with the information he had, having been driven by a desire to help people in need, and who was painted as a villain because of it. But I think what really concerns me about this is the fan response to these episodes, as I've already kind of alluded to previously. It's not anything new that fans will change the facts of the show in their mind and dismiss any content that goes against the version of the story they want to have seen. Many of them are unwilling to accept that the thing they like may have just done a poor job connecting themes with the actual text, and so they have this idea of it in their heads that never actually existed. We saw that a lot when Ahsoka came out, and not a single person could even agree on what the message of episode 5 was supposed to be. But the reaction to this episode is a bit more dangerous. There's been a frankly disturbing trend of people abandoning the most basic moral principles in order to make the show's botched attempts at themes work. They refuse the very notion that the plot doesn't justify what the show is saying happened, and so in order to blindly accept the message that the Jedi have done anything wrong, they're twisting themselves into heinous knots in an attempt to bridge the gap. And as a result, they force themselves to defend child abuse, cult behavior, and even in some cases, defending the permissibility of violating other people's minds and bodies. Put simply, they're defending the fucking indefensible. I don't necessarily think you're a bad person if you do this, but I do strongly suggest that you really stop and think about what stance you're taking if you unironically think this is any kind of morally complex situation where neither side comes out entirely virtuous. Cognitive dissonance is a very real thing, and it can be a strong drug when it's something you enjoy, so don't take any of this personally. I just want us all to employ basic critical thinking skills. And circling all the way back to the original point about waiting for context, like I said, I waited for it, and, well, we got it. And I just want to hammer home the overall point of why I brought that up. Again, I get that you guys are just trying to be fair, but the reason so many people are so quick to make certain predictions when we haven't seen the full show is because we're following a pattern. Following the same logic you guys use to determine that it's disingenuous to jump to conclusions prematurely, I'd argue it's just as disingenuous to ignore data that repeatedly gives us the same results. In the last 2 years, we've gotten 6 different seasons of live-action Star Wars shows, and only one of them has been well written. So yes, we might have determined from that pretty overwhelming sample size that the Acolyte was probably not going to be good, but we had good reason to. And if the show had ended up being good, a lot of us who are attempting good faith would have come away with the conclusion that our prediction was wrong. You know, kinda like what we did with Andor. What I find interesting is that I really don't ever see any other fandom say this about other shows. It's really only with Star Wars that you'll get this. And it's not just with the Acolyte, but since this is ostensibly a mystery show, and therefore therefore by design is meant to leave certain questions unanswered as we slowly unravel the truth across the season, that is what a lot of people will use as a reasoning for why you should wait for more context. The Acolyte spent like half the finale setting up for more to come. We've got the Darth Plagueis tease, the Rey and Court Vernestra rivalry, as well as Vernestra's apparent connection to Jason and her search for him that'll no doubt be a plotline in season 2. And we have a Reylo-esque dynamic built between Jason and Osha, despite the fact that he murdered several people she cared about and took her captive. But no, guys, they're totally a power couple.
I'm just going to put it out there. There was a version that we filmed where Osha and the stranger actually kiss, but we felt that it may not have been too earned at that moment. I think it was just too early on. The stranger killed a bunch of her friends, and she just killed her father-like figure. For them to have this sensual moment just didn't feel like it was appropriate.
Yeah, I think you're right.
But I suggested, maybe not the kiss, but how about a handhold? Some sort of wanting to console, some sort of physicality that expresses that he cares for her and feels for her, and that they're in this together now. That's something that, if we do a season 2, maybe we can work towards if the fans want it.
I might actually puke. Get back a little. I'm gonna puke. Stay back. Oh my. I'm gonna throw up. Okay. I'm gonna throw up.
But just because The Acolyte is ostensibly a mystery show, that doesn't mean you should have to wait for every new episode just for basic things like plot and character work to make sense. One of my favorite shows ever written is The Haunting of Bly Manor, which is a great little Netflix series by Mike Flanagan that loosely adapts The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. It follows an American woman named Danny Clayton who signed on to be the au pair for a couple of rich kids living in a big mansion with no parents to speak of, an uncle who technically is their legal guardian but who never sees them, and the only authority figures in their lives aside from Danny are Hannah the maid, Owen the cook, and Jamie the gardener. Throughout the show, we slowly unravel the mystery behind the manor's haunting, what's causing it, and how to stop it, and along the way it tells a compelling, rich story that's thematically poignant and never contradicts itself. Even though by design this show doesn't answer every question right off the bat, it gives you more than enough information to understand the stakes, and even if you fully don't know what's going on, you still at least get the gist. The place is haunted, and all these characters are in serious danger. There aren't gaping holes or contrivances in the plot that make me question if the writers even know what's going on, and this is achieved because they put in the effort to make the story make sense, because they have pride in their fucking work. One reason I wanted to quickly compare these two shows is the fact that something The Acolyte suffers from is the way its episodes are structured. For whatever reason, in this 8-episode season of television that are typically no more than 30 to 40 minutes apiece, there are 2 entire episodes dedicated to flashbacks, and a lot of episode 7 reuses large chunks of the same scenes we've already seen without providing any additional context than what we already knew, so it's just redundant. The pacing is in shambles, but Bly Manor does a similar thing where, just like with The Acolyte, the penultimate episode is entirely a flashback explaining in great detail what exactly is going on and why it's all happening. It's sandwiched between a cliffhanger ending and is followed by the continuation of that ending, which a lot of people who've seen the show find rather frustrating, but I think it's done quite well. It's placed exactly where it needs to be so as not to give away too much information early on that would spoil the mystery aspect, but comes just in time to make sure we all understand the stakes that'll be relevant for the finale. It makes sense that they had to spend a whole episode on this flashback because there's a lot of information we need and it'll take a lot of time to get across properly. But unlike The Acolyte, it doesn't waste our time unnecessarily, and more importantly, it bolsters the overarching themes of the show rather than contradicting them. It's a good watch, and I highly recommend the show if you haven't already seen it. I can go on all day about how great this show is, and someday maybe I will. But the point I'm getting at is that you can write a mystery show that doesn't hinge on the entire plot making sense if only the audience waits for the final episode to put it all together. And even at that point, it's still broken. With TV shows in general, going beyond just the mystery genre, we should be able to get a sense of if a show is going to be good or bad within the first few episodes. We should more or less be able to tell what we're signing up for after getting engrossed in the world a little bit. And even if it takes a nosedive toward the end, we can at least look back at the early stuff and be able to go, yeah, but it was once quite something. It just seems paradoxical to me that fans have this mindset of, it'll make sense by the end, just you wait, but they also pull the whole, if you don't like it, don't watch it card, which Star Wars fans have been saying for years now. If it's currently not good, but it will get better with proper context, then shouldn't I keep watching it? Would it not behoove me to stick around till the end just to see if my initial skepticism was wrong? Or are we willing to finally concede that it's kind of silly to tell people to wait for context after a gaping plot hole is introduced a few episodes before the finale? I think I've more or less said my piece. You guys get the point by now. Even though there's a plethora more I could say about this show, really I only scratched the surface here, I think I'm going to end the video here for the sake of my own quality of life. It should be noted that discourse surrounding The Acolyte was a shitstorm from even before it came out. I think of all the Disney Plus Star Wars shows, this one ended up being the most unpleasant to try to discuss with people online. And I think I also said that about Ahsoka when that was coming out, but that should just tell you it's getting worse and worse every time. I don't know what's in the water or how we as a fandom have devolved to this point of shit-slinging and name-calling, but I'm frankly getting really sick of it. If you unironically think anyone who criticizes this show in any capacity is a toxic hater who just wants to ruin your fun, well, I guarantee you haven't made it this far into the video anyway, but if you have, maybe fucking grow up? I don't know, man. It's just a TV show. For those of you who want to see more in-depth breakdowns of the show, I'll remind you once again that there are plenty of hours worth of live streams up on my channel where my friends and I discuss it at length, so go ahead and give those a listen. I'll link a playlist in the description for convenience sake. Also want to give a big thank you to Southpaw for helping edit this video, and to Jolly for lending me his voice for that excerpt reading a bit ago. They're both lovely lads who make talking about this slop almost tolerable. And their channels can be found below as well. Let's see what else is there. Oh, I guess I'll advertise my Discord since these motherfuckers won't leave me alone about it. I have a Discord. There. Now it's been advertised. That's it for today. Ta-ta for now!